begin with the quiet of a man who has already seen too much. When Tiberius Caesar accepted the purple in the autumn of the year 14 after Christ, Rome breathed in relief more than celebration. The legions knew him as the commander who had steadied the Rhine after the Varian disaster, who moved like a chess player through rugged valleys in Pannonia and along the cold edges of Germania. He was not the golden air people composed verses about. He was the tool that still held an edge. Augustus's careful architecture of power titles layered like tiles on a roof. Tribunician authority, proconsular power renewed again and again, passed to a soldier who understood walls, supply and patience. At first it seemed enough. The opening years felt like a continuation of the long Augustan dusk. Taxes tightened but not strangling. Governors reminded they were servants, not princes, no reckless wars for applause. Even the Senate in ceremony and speech found itself consulted with a decorous frequency that stiffened old spines, without actually handing them the republic they once owned. Tiberius counted coin, openly clipped expenses that pleased no mob, and refused flattery with the curtness of a man allergic to theatre. It was governance by restraint, a tamping down of the embers rather than a stirring of the fire. But the mask of competence often sits on a face already lined with private weather. Before the laurel, Tiberius had been manoeuvred like a piece in another man's endgame. A first marriage ended for policy, a second yoking him to Julia Augustus's daughter, whose scandal public biting was exile and humiliation for them. Both. He withdrew once before to Rhodes, a self-banishment dressed up as study, a pilot stepping away from the helm while storms gathered in the west. Those years left sediment in him, reserve congealed into suspicion, duty into a kind of inward stoicism that could look like frost. The early calm began to crack along these old fault lines. The empire learned how grief reshapes a ruler's hands when his son Drusus died in the year 23. The official language was decorum and fate. The private aftershocks were longer, darker and less legible. Rumors attached themselves to silence. Poison was whispered. Treachery was guessed. Those who watched the emperor closely said that something subtle shifted. Letters grew colder. Audiences briefer, praise harder to earn and easier to misplace. A state can remain outwardly efficient while the mind at its center leans toward shadows. Withdrawal became policy. In the year 26, Tiberius sailed south and did not return. Capri, the rock that lifts its sheer cliffs from blue water inside the Bay of Naples, was more than a refuge from the city's demands. It was a deliberate experiment in distance. From 12 villas placed like watchfires across the island, architectural achievements that chiseled terraces into living stone, plumbed water, up ledges and latched colonnades to sky, the emperor rewired his empire through parchment seals and messengers. The Senate still met beneath painted ceilings, still congratulated itself in careful Latin, but the air had changed. Decisions now crossed narrow seas before they crossed the forum. Distance altered scale. What in Rome might have been tempered by a glance became on Capri a line in a letter stiffened by paranoia. Men who had never seen the emperor's face learned to fear his handwriting. The archives begin to show a proliferation of requests for clarification. Humble, hedged, rehearsed because officials sensed that meaning might be read against them. The logic of rule flattened into correspondence and reporter bureaucracy that functioned with the precision of a clock and the warmth of one too. There were counselors, of course. Every isolation builds a court. Thrasyllus, the astrologer, became the most quoted name in whispers, not because he invented stars but because he could translate anxiety into orbit. Omens have always been the politics of people who cannot see the room. When Tiberius asked about dispositions and governors, he also asked about conjunctions and hours. He was not the first Roman to consult the sky. He may have been the first to let the sky instruct his suspicions. This is how superstition becomes administration. Not in the obvious ritual, but in the subtle tilt: who is avoided, who is promoted, which letter goes unanswered 3 days too long. Capri itself conspired with this new mood. The place's dramatic paths that cling to cliff drops that reduce even a hardened soldier to caution, a horizon line so pure it can feel unreal. Beauty does not cure fear. It teaches seclusion how to linger. The emperor built spaces that controlled sightlines and entrances. Villas where you could see approaching boats as white scratches on slate water long before they landed. Loggias where sea wind erased. Voices, gardens that smelled of laurel and myrtle and told nothing. Architecture can be an argument. Here it argued that Rome could be governed from a balcony with enough messengers and enough caution. From that balcony, Tiberius perfected government by absence. He allowed the city to perform its rituals without him, and discovered that presence had long been more theatre than necessity. The Praetorian Guard tightened its choreography. Provincial accounts arrived with the neatness of trained hands. the treasury still stout from Augustus's careful hoarding, and Tiberius's thrift gave the illusion that systems were healthier than the heart that powered them. Senators, relieved of the unpredictable heat of imperial audiences, grew bold in safe directions and servile in the dangerous ones. What looked like continuity was in fact a shift in weight, more of the load now borne by paper, fewer by people daring to speak. The letters themselves changed tone. At first they were clipped military memoranda: move this, detachment, audit that account, discipline here, praise there. Over time they acquired the texture of cross-examination. Why was that statue unveiled on the 7th day and not the 8th as decreed? Who was present at a poet's reading where a phrase about thunder might have been a metaphor for power? How long did the applause last? And who began it? The distance that had promised calm now filtered every signal through suspicion. The city adapted. It always does. Public speech narrowed until it could pass through the eye of a needle. At dinner, people learned to let laughter lag half a heartbeat in case the joke could be taken 2 ways. Patrons corrected their clients' greetings in doorways before the greetings had a chance to be overheard. The playwrights moved to myth and stayed there. Historians threaded their sentences with antique names so that everyone could pretend that yesterday's critique was merely Thucydides retold. This is not yet terror. This is the preparation for it, the quiet rearrangement of life so that danger has fewer handles to grab. On Capri, meanwhile, the court's choreography tightened. Audiences were scheduled like eclipses. The emperor emerged on his own terms, well-briefed, brief, occasionally sardonic, never careless. He knew the value of a pause. A commander's patience, useful in the field, turned cold in the palace. Petitioners learned that the longest distance in the empire was not the Tyrrhenian Sea, but the space between a bow and an answer. Reward came still, promotion existed, efficiency was noticed. But so did the opposite, and it travelled faster. A rumour could take ship at dusk and reach Rome by dawn with a seal on it. The men who prospered were the ones who understood the new grammar, prefects who spoke in reports rather than promises, secretaries who erased themselves from the record while multiplying their influence inside it, administrators who could compress local complexity into 3 crisp lines that would not irritate a sleepless emperor. The old Roman virtue of frank counsel, blunt-grained, sometimes rude, shrunk inside the island wind, and yet the empire did not fall. Roads were maintained, aqueducts flowed, ships moved grain from Africa to the Tiber's mouths, the northern frontiers held their line. That is part of the seduction systems that function. Let a ruler believe his instincts are correct. Tiberius watched the graphs of revenue and the placidity of borders, and concluded that distance was wisdom. Capri seemed to prove him right, even as that same distance untied the knots that had once bound ruler and ruled in mutual sight. Ask where the turning begins, and you will find answers that seem plausible, because history rarely turns on one hinge. A son's death. An old humiliation that never stopped echoing. A temperament that preferred silence to spectacle. The architecture of a system that could operate without the human presence that had once softened it. An astrologer's daily counsel calibrated to a mind leaning already toward caution. Layer them, and a picture emerges, not yet the nightmare Rome will later whisper about, but the conditions for it: a ruler alone, with his thoughts, a city that has learned to speak less, and a state that runs with the efficient chill of a machine. In this first part we have only entered the antechamber. Capri is a landscape and a policy. The emperor is still the soldier who counts coin, still the administrator who avoids unnecessary wars, still the austere man who keeps ceremonies in order and flattery at bay. But the letters are lengthening. The questions are narrowing. The wind across the terraces is carrying fewer voices. If you stand at the edge of the cliff and look outward, the horizon promises clarity. If you turn and look inland toward the villas and the guarded doors, you begin to understand how clarity can become isolation, and isolation can become rule. The island was a fortress of cliffs, but the real fortress was made of paper and ink. Capri gave Tiberius seclusion, but it also gave him distance from the city's eyes, and that distance allowed suspicion to spread until it hardened into method. Fear became not just a byproduct of rule, but the very instrument of it. The old Roman charge of Maiesta's injury to the dignity of the Roman people had once been a shield to protect the state from real treachery. Under Tiberius it became a net cast so wide that no one knew where it ended. A man could be accused for carrying coins bearing the emperor's likeness into a brothel. Another might be accused for a careless expression at a public reading. Even silence could become incriminating if it fell in the wrong place. The beauty of such a law from the emperor's view was its vagueness. Anything could be treason if he willed it so. The law no longer restrained, it enabled. Professional informers, the delatores, thrived. They listened in forums at recitals over cups of watered wine, ready to pounce on a phrase or gesture that could be twisted into an accusation. Theirs was a new market, and the currency was human life. A senator's confiscated estate might pass in part to the informer whose words condemned him. Men who had once debated laws now debated how best to phrase an anonymous denunciation. Fear became profitable. Suspicion turned into economy. Tiberius himself rarely acquitted the accused. To be charged was to be half dead already. Trials became theatres where the ending was known in advance and the actors merely played out the scene. Torture supplied the necessary confessions, and the emperor's appetite for clever cruelty sometimes designed the methods. One prisoner was forced to drink wine until his body swelled, and his agony became a spectacle. Another was reprieved for days, told he was pardoned, then executed after hope had just begun to heal. To Tiberius, mercy itself could be twisted into torture if it was withdrawn at the right moment. Rome's city of endless conversation fell quiet. Dinner parties that once thrummed with poetry, satire, political debate became rehearsals in restraint. Friends grew dangerous. A cousin might be an informer. A client might trade a careless word for survival. The arts bent with the wind. Poets returned to mythic themes too distant to offend. Historians buried their judgments in accounts of the distant past. Plays grew flatter, less biting, their humor cautious to the point of emptiness. The Republic's tradition of speech had been smothered under the fear of a misinterpreted syllable. Inside the Senate, the transformation was even more stark. Senators had once resisted Hannibal, once weighed war and peace for the fate of nations. Now they competed in proposing honors for a man who would not even face them in person. Each decree was a mask of loyalty worn in desperation. Clemency, if suggested, risked looking like defiance. Condemnation was safer even against one's own peers. Some senators chose suicide rather than await the inevitable charges. Death on their own terms meant their families might keep a fragment of dignity and a sliver of wealth. Even natural death did not always protect Tiberius. Sometimes ordered prosecutions of the dead estates, seized memory, mutilated. It was a society unthreading itself. Trust, the ancient Roman glue that bound patron to client, father to son, senator to senator, became poison. Parents told children to guard their tongues even in dreams, lest sleep itself betray them. This was terror not of mobs or soldiers but of words, of glances, of silence. Rome still bustled, traders still hawked wares, amphitheaters still roared with games. But beneath the roar was the knowledge that anyone at any moment might be marked out by the ink of Capri. From the emperor's viewpoint, this was safety. From the cities, it was suffocation. The Senate that once prided itself on frank debate was now a hall of masks. The people who once shaped laws now shaped their own expressions in mirrors before venturing out. Rome had been proud of its freedom to speak. Now its greatest skill was learning how not to. What had been a culture of voice became a culture of silence, and silence in time corrodes the very soul of a state. When a ruler vanishes into seclusion, someone else must fill the vacuum. In Rome, that man was Lucius alias Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. At first, Sejanus appeared to be only a prefect with ambition. The guard had been created as a protective body stationed in scattered barracks across the city. Under Sejanus, those detachments were gathered into a single fortified camp on the edge of Rome, a subtle but decisive shift. The emperor might be on Capri, but Sejanus's soldiers could march into the Senate within minutes. Power no longer hid in the forum's marble, it crouched behind a palisade. Sejanus became the voice of the absent emperor, a filter through which every petition, every hope, every fear had to pass. Senators courted him. Governors sent reports to him before they dared send them to Capri. Ambitious men aligned their fortunes with him, believing the island exile might never return, and that Rome's true master was already in the city. Statues of Sejanus were erected, his name spoken in tones that carried both awe and calculation. For nearly a decade he acted as if he were co-emperor in all but name. But Tiberius was never careless with his paranoia. The same instincts that had led him to retreat to Capri kept him watchful over the prefect who seemed too indispensable. Rumors reached him that Sejanus was arranging dynastic marriages, weaving himself into the Julio-Claudian line. In 31, without warning, Tiberius's letters turned cold and then lethal. A message arrived in the Senate, oblique, artful, and then direct, ordering Sejanus's arrest. The man who had strutted through Rome with imperial confidence was dragged from the Curia and executed within hours. His statues were toppled, his name cursed, his allies hunted. The purge that followed did not stop with him. Hundreds were implicated, some guilty of ambition, many guilty only of association. It was a demonstration of Tiberius's enduring skill in cruelty. He could still orchestrate a downfall from miles away with only ink and wax seals as weapons. Sejanus's fall proved that the emperor's absence was never complete. Capri was a fortress, but from it he could reach into Rome with the precision of a knife. After Sejanus, paranoia became policy in earnest. The island ruler saw plots in every shadow. Letters arrived with more names to condemn, more trials to stage, more estates to confiscate. Capri's beauty, the cliffs bathed in Mediterranean light gardens, scented with myrtle villas that caught both dawn and sunset, became the backdrop for an emperor's decline. His face, described by contemporaries, grew ravaged by disease, his skin marked with sores that no ointment could conceal. He wore wigs and layers of powder, a mask for a man already withdrawing behind layers of fear. Even his meals became rituals of suspicion. Food tested first on condemned prisoners, watched closely for signs of agony before he dared to eat. The more the emperor shrank into his lair, the more the empire itself shrank into secrecy. Officials knew their fates could turn with a single rumor whispered into Capri's ear. The Praetorian Guard, once tools of Sejanus, became again the emperor's weapon, but now they were used less for protection than for punishment. A senator's household might be ransacked at midnight. Families might be broken overnight by a single accusation. Even children were no longer guaranteed safety. Roman law had once hesitated to execute minors. Under Tiberius, that protection eroded. The state itself seemed to absorb his paranoia, transforming into a machine that fed on its own citizens. And yet, astonishingly, the mechanisms of empire did not collapse. Grain fleets still arrived, aqueducts still poured water into the city, legions still stood their posts on distant frontiers. This was the paradox of his reign. The machinery of Rome was so vast, so resilient, that even while it was twisted by suspicion and blood, it kept running. To the outside world, Rome was still the colossus of order. Inside, the Senate chambers stank of fear, and Capri became a symbol whispered like a curse. It was no longer only a retreat. It was the throne of a man whose power had turned inward, devouring trust, loyalty, and the very breath of free speech. By the early 32nd of the 1st century, the contrast was unbearable. A city pretending to live normally, and an island that ruled by absence, suspicion, and letters edged with death. In that distance, Tiberius's reign passed from competent austerity into remembered terror. What had begun as discipline was dissolving into decay, and the island cliffs that once promised peace had become the fortress of Rome's most haunted sovereign. On the surface, Rome still functioned. Its markets bustled with sellers of grain, olives, and garum, its amphitheaters filled with cheers. Its legions patrolled the Rhine and Danube with a discipline inherited from earlier generations. The empire's arteries remained unclogged, taxes collected, aqueducts, maintained, governors dispatched to their provinces. To an outsider, Rome looked as steady as ever, the unshaken ruler of the Mediterranean. Yet beneath this mask of order, decay seeped quietly through every joint of the state. The economy itself showed the paradox most clearly. Confiscations of condemned senators' estates fattened the treasury, but at a terrible price. Wealthy families learned that prosperity itself was dangerous. To be too rich, too visible, too generous in one's spending was to invite the gaze of Capri. Many chose to scatter their wealth quickly or to hide it in layers of legal subterfuge. Investment dried up, risk-taking faltered. The empire could afford its vast bureaucracy. But the entrepreneurial spirit that had once pushed Roman elites to build roads, harbors, or theaters began to shrink. A culture that had once thrived on conspicuous generosity, sponsoring games, erecting monuments, now calculated how to appear small. Art and literature bent under this pressure. Under Augustus, poets had sung of empire with dazzling creativity. Under Tiberius, myth and safe nostalgia crowded the page. Writers buried sharp observation in veiled illusion, or destroyed their own manuscripts rather than risk them being read the wrong way. A society that once prided itself on frank speech became expert in coded silences. The theatre, once a stage for satire, grew flat and cautious. Even architecture reflected the change. Augustus had filled the city with marble temples and public works to dazzle the citizenry. Tiberius, by contrast, left behind no grand civic legacy. His great constructions were on Capri private villas for a private court, while in Rome the public saw little but the looming presence of the Praetorian camp. Religion too darkened under his reign. Romans had always sought signs in the heavens, but now omens carried a sharper edge. Earthquakes, floods, and fires were whispered about as punishments for imperial corruption. Traditional rituals were performed with an unease that even priests could not conceal. Some cults, fearing imperial attention, retreated underground rather than risk being bent into tools for imperial ceremony. The gods, once anchors of civic confidence, now seemed to turn their faces away. The emperor's court astrologers interpreted conjunctions as reasons to execute, not to guide. Superstition no longer complemented politics. It had become indistinguishable from it. Foreign relations bore the marks of this inward corrosion. Ambassadors from allied kingdoms lingered for years without an audience, unsure whether Capri would grant them honor or death. Provincial rulers found their children kept in Rome as hostages to guarantee their obedience. Across the eastern frontier, Parthian envoys watched with astonishment as the empire that had cowed them turned its weapons inward. The empire's sheer size meant borders did not collapse, but the tone shifted. Governors on the edge of the empire, more concerned with their own survival than with administration, allowed small cracks to form. Rome's iron discipline was rusting from within. In the military, the transformation was subtle but deadly. The legions remained competent by habit and tradition, but promotions increasingly depended on civility rather than merit. Officers gained advancement, not by courage, but by their willingness to inform or procure. The Praetorian Guard, once sworn to shield the emperor, became instruments of his suspicion, enforcers of terror in Rome itself. Veterans who had once dreamed of glory now whispered about throwing children from cliffs or dragging senators through trials. The proudest institution of Rome was bending toward corruption, even as it kept its surface sheen. Daily life in the city reflected this strange duality. Bakers still rose before dawn, hawkers still filled the forum, charioteers still thundered in the circus. Rome looked unchanged. But in the conversations behind shutters, in the hesitation before laughter, in the careful scanning of faces at banquets, the change was visible. What had once been an empire of voices had become an empire of glances. The city kept breathing, but each breath was shallow, cautious, borrowed. This is the unsettling truth of Tiberius's middle reign, that an empire can continue to function while its soul rots. Taxes are still paid, trade still flows, law still operates, yet all of it is bent, twisted, poisoned by fear. Rome had not collapsed. In fact, by many measures it thrived. But it was a prosperity hollowed by silence, a strength masking weakness. It is far easier for a society to endure cruelty than to endure uncertainty. Under Tiberius, Rome endured both at once, and it left scars that would not heal for generations. Why did Rome tolerate it? How did the greatest city in the world, with centuries of pride in law and liberty, bend so fully beneath one man's shadow? The answer is not simple. It lies not only in the terror Tiberius unleashed, but in the systems and instincts that made complicity easier than resistance. The Principate itself had prepared the ground. Augustus had wrapped monarchy in republican clothing, dressing absolute power in senatorial togas and rituals of consultation. By the time Tiberius ruled, senators were already conditioned to bow while pretending to deliberate. When the emperor withdrew to Capri, the Senate discovered its own hollowness. It could issue decrees, but only the ones it knew the emperor wanted. A body that had once stood eye to eye with generals now lowered its gaze to the parchment arriving from an island. The structures of Rome had been carefully designed to preserve the appearance of freedom while removing its substance. Tiberius simply stripped away the pretense. But fear alone does not sustain a reign that lasted more than 2 decades. There were rewards for loyalty. The delatores, those professional accusers, grew rich. Every confiscated estate left spoils for the emperor to distribute. Ambitious courtiers learned that silence was not enough, one had to be useful. And so they became the emperor's accomplices, feeding suspicion, producing victims, offering names. Human flesh itself became currency. Senators offered their rivals. Noble families sacrificed their children's marriages to imperial designs. Governors supplied whomever Capri requested. To refuse was dangerous. To comply was profitable. Rome built a marketplace where the commodity was survival. Cultural habits made the adjustment easier. Romans had always lived with brutality, gladiatorial games, slavery, public execution, the exposure of unwanted infants. When Tiberius's cruelty spread through the empire, it did not feel like something wholly alien. It felt like an intensification, a distortion of customs already accepted. The crowd that watched men torn apart in the amphitheater could imagine without much effort their emperor turning cruelty into policy. It was shocking, but it was not incomprehensible. And because it was not incomprehensible, many found ways to live with it. The real horror lies in the ordinary faces that sustained the system. The secretaries who carried letters, the guards who enforced orders, the informers who whispered at banquets, all were human beings making choices. Some told themselves they had no choice, that refusal meant death. Others saw opportunity. The emperor could not maintain a reign of suspicion alone. He required collaborators at every rung. Many of them thrived. Some would survive him, carrying their wealth and reputations into the next reign, their hands clean only on the surface. This is the anatomy of complicity, not monsters in isolation but ordinary people bending, yielding, calculating, until the sum of their choices constructs a system that feels immovable. The cost was immense. Social trust withered. Families no longer trusted one another. Friends guarded their words, even lovers whispered in fear of walls that might have ears. A society once proud of its sharp tongues and fearless speech became a society trained in concealment. The young grew up not learning how to argue but how to survive, how to flatter without fawning, how to appear loyal without drawing, notice how to hide thoughts behind eyes that revealed nothing. It was an education in self-preservation, not citizenship. And yet this very complicity explains why the empire endured. By bending, Rome avoided breaking. By collaborating, individuals survived even while the collective decayed. The paradox of Tiberius's reign is that it shows both the fragility of freedom and the resilience of systems. A republic had become a monarchy in disguise, and under that disguise the habits of obedience grew strong. Rome tolerated him not because it loved him but because it feared him, and because fear taught collaboration. In this way the empire continued, efficient, functional, terrifying. The price was a generation marked by silence and a legacy of mistrust that would outlast the emperor himself. The end came not with daggers in the night but with the slow decay of age and suspicion. Tiberius, once the lean general who had paced riverside camps in Germania, now stumbled through his villas with a body ravaged by disease. Ancient writers describe his face scarred by ulcers, his skin marked with sores hidden beneath wigs and thick powder. He no longer resembled a ruler, he resembled a ghost still clutching power. Fear had consumed him so fully that he would not eat without forcing condemned men to taste his food first. He slept, surrounded by guards who in turn were watched by other guards. Paranoia had become not only his method of ruling but the air he breathed. And yet he clung to power. Even in his 70s he scrawled orders for executions. Astrologers were summoned daily, asked not only about Rome's fate but about the hour of his own death. Anyone who predicted it too soon was punished, yet he returned to the question again and again. It was as though he both feared and courted the end, a man who had ruled by death, now obsessively measuring his own. Briefly he even returned to the mainland and towns shuddered as if a plague had arrived. People hid their sons and daughters, delegations trembled at audiences. The emperor's presence was no longer honor but calamity. In 37 the vigil ended. Accounts differ. Some say he died naturally at Misenum, aged 77, his body simply failing after decades of suspicion. Others whisper that Macro, the new Praetorian prefect, smothered him with a cloak when it seemed he might recover from a faint. Whatever the truth, the death of Tiberius released a breath Rome had held for 23 years. Word reached the city and celebration erupted. Crowds shouted to the Tiber with Tiberius, demanding his corpse be flung into the river like a criminal's. The Senate, suddenly unshackled, hesitated even to grant him divine honors. Only the intervention of his successor Gaius Caligula secured a perfunctory funeral. The rituals were performed, but the grief was hollow. Where Augustus had been mourned as a father, Tiberius was discarded as a curse. Historians would debate forever how much of the horror was real. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio each wrote with disgust but also with agendas. Later generations wondered if enemies had exaggerated. After all, the empire had remained stable. Roads, fleets, armies had continued their work. But the sheer consistency of the accounts, the terror etched into letters and graffiti, the suicides of senators who preferred death to trial, all suggest that even if details grew lurid, the essence was true. Tiberius had ruled not only with cruelty, but with a creativity of cruelty, turning suspicion into a culture and fear into an institution. And that was his real legacy. Rome survived him, yes, and produced emperors both worse and better. But never again could the people trust the Principate in the same way. Augustus had built it as a compromise monarchy hidden under republican forms, a promise of stability after chaos. Tiberius revealed what that compromise could become when the man at its center withdrew conscience from power. The Senate never recovered its dignity. The law twisted under his reign remained stretched. Future emperors inherited tools forged in terror, treason, trials, informers, confiscations. The shadow of Capri lingered long after the villas fell silent. The people too carried scars. A generation had been raised in silence, trained to watch their tongues, to mistrust their friends, to bend before suspicion. Even when the emperor died, habits endured. Survival had replaced citizenship. Fear had become reflex. Rome had not fallen, but something in its soul had withered. The empire that still conquered, still traded, still dazzled, the world had revealed to itself that it could also rot from within. Perhaps this is why the story of Tiberius endures with such force. He was not only a tyrant but proof of a larger truth that civilization is fragile, that laws and rituals can be bent until they serve cruelty, that silence and complicity can be as destructive as open violence. His reign warns not only of what power can do to a man, but of what fear can do to a people. That is the shadow Capri cast across centuries, the reminder that Rome's strength was real, but its conscience could be lost in a single lifetime. Tiberius died despised, alone, and unrepentant. His name became shorthand for corruption, his island villas, symbols of hidden horror. Yet Rome endured, and in the endurance lies a paradox. Evil, however vast, is not immortal. The empire outlasted him, and so did the memory of what he had done. The stones of Capri still stand, washed by the same blue water, touched by the same Mediterranean sun. Tourists today marvel at their beauty. Few think about the letters sealed there, the orders written, the silence cultivated. But history remembers, and in remembering it denies him the victory of being forgotten. This finally is the lesson of Tiberius, that unchecked power corrupts not only the one who holds it but all who enable it, and that forgetting such corruption is the surest way to invite it again. Rome never fully cleansed the stain he left. Neither should we.